Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for our monthly webinar. Today we'll be talking about taking another look at SharePoint. Today I'll be joined by my colleague, SteveLongenecker. As we get started today, appreciate everybody filling out the survey form with some of those questions, so we'll incorporate some feedback into those during the session, but you can also use the chat feature to chat in your questions. We won't actually have any polls today, but do hope to have some time to interact during the session, so chat in your questions as you have them. And obviously, if you want to focus to avoid multitasking, you might just miss the best part. While everyone will receive a copy of the recording and a link to the PowerPoint will go out as well. So again, appreciate any feedback that you all will have during the session as we go along, and look forward to chatting about this today.
Hey, Matt.
Yes, Steve.
Matt? Oh, good. I just wanted to interrupt to make sure you could hear me. That's all I wanted to say.
So a little bit about Community IT. So Community IT has been around since 1993, so we are in our, I guess, 21st year, depending on how you count. And so during that time, we've worked with over 900 nonprofits. Since that time, I actually started as an intern, actually just about 14 years ago. So it's been great to be a part of the organization for that duration. And I think we really do a good job of providing strategic and collaborative work with the organizations that we do serve, and since we've been around for so long and we are focused entirely on the nonprofit sector, we I think do a great job of being invested in the success of your organization and helping organizations use technology to meet their mission. So as I mentioned, I'll be joined by Steve, my colleague Steve Longenecker. He's a project manager at Community IT, and we've got the Twitter handles for both Community IT and also myself. So please feel free to follow us along on Twitter. We'll be doing a bit of tweeting out during the session, so you can follow us or follow along with the hashtag SharePoint. So if you want to engage with us, you can use that hashtag and just mention us, and hopefully we'll provide some additional information as we go along. We do have quite a bit of content to cover today, so I think we're going to go ahead and just get started. Today we'll be talking about a general overview of kind of the background of SharePoint. I think some historical context to kind of how we got to where we are today. Specifically today, this session will be mostly geared around using SharePoint Online as a file server replacement. So SharePoint can do a lot of different things, and I know that there's some folks attending today that are already using it, maybe extensively. This session will be geared primarily towards people that are being introduced to SharePoint and looking to get started. I think based on the responses that we've had, I think there's a need out there for some more sophisticated follow-up for those organizations that are already using SharePoint and maybe want to do some more sophisticated use cases. And so I think we'll be scheduling a follow-up webinar sometime later in the fall. So thanks for all of the input. So specifically, we'll be talking about our pilot approach at Community IT. So we're testing it and using it ourselves, and then we'll wrap up with some reflections and best practices, along with some dedicated time for QA at the end if we have it. As I mentioned, if you have questions, please feel free to go ahead and use the chat feature as we go along, and I'll try to pick those up. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve now to talk a little bit about the evolution of SharePoint.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So SharePoint first came out in, I think, 2001, something like that. You know what? I can't see my notes here, so I'm going to grab those in a second. But let me get. So we were early on, and I used the acronym CITI. That's not the brand. We're Community IT now. It's still Community IT Innovators. But back in those days, we were CITI. So that was an intentional on my part. We set up Windows SharePoint Services 2.0 site in an attempt to see what this was about, see if it was going to be something that would work for our clients, and we really gave it a good effort, and it really did not catch hold with us. We were using it to try to do some knowledge sharing among ourselves about technology, and it just didn't work. It was way too many clicks, too cumbersome. It just didn't, and it didn't fit an operational need that we had at the time, and that was kind of important to us. A few years later, Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 came out. It was much improved. Sort of the thing I want to emphasize on point number 2 was that there was also Microsoft Office SharePoint Services 2007, which is at least at the same time. And this is sort of Microsoft's sort of wanting to have it both ways. They wanted SharePoint to get some better traction in the market. They wanted to get more share. So they Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 was included as part of the Windows Server operating system. You didn't have to pay any extra for that, and the licensing of it was just a regular user cal. But then it wasn't quite as full-featured at all as Microsoft Office SharePoint Services, and so there was the licensing for the full product was pretty arduous in those days. Especially, even for charities, it was too expensive. SharePoint Foundation 2010, the years there give you a clue about when that came out. SharePoint Foundation was accompanied by another, like a full server product, but the SharePoint Foundation, while not as full-featured as the full product, was a pretty good product, and I think worked for certain people, for certain organizations as a nice product that didn't, again, require the licensing. And then now we're at SharePoint Online, which is, there is an on-premise version of SharePoint, and in fact, for people who have the on-premise SharePoint, I think the fact that Microsoft is really emphasizing the SharePoint Online, which I don't even know if they use that term. I think they want to just call it Office 365 SharePoint. But the Office 365 SharePoint is definitely where Microsoft seems to want to head, and there is concern, what does that do for those of us who've invested heavily in our on-premise solution? It is the fact that it's part of Office 365 that has really reawakened Community IT's interest in the product. Not that we ever completely forgot about it, but the fact that charities can get Office 365 for the E1 license cost is waived, so it's essentially free at the E1 level, makes it very interesting. I mean, if you don't have to pay subscription prices, then you certainly want to consider it, and that's where we are today.
Great. Thanks for the overview, Steve. So as we move on, I think the point is that SharePoint can be can do a lot of different things.
Right. So so that's what this slide here is, and the thing here is that well, the question is whether SharePoint does so much that it's not that great at any one thing, and I think I put that up that title that slide somewhat facetiously. I think actually SharePoint does some of the things that it does pretty well, but it is amazing how much it can be used. And in the notes on one of these slides, we have a slide share that's sort of talks about SharePoint at a much a highly developed state, and some of the things that people are using it for is pretty amazing. But you can certainly use it for an internet portal. I think that was sort of the original vision that we certainly had for when we ran out that Windows services back in 2004, Windows SharePoint Services 2.0 thing, internet portal. But it's also document management. That's what is interesting to us now, is the idea that it might replace a file server. Extranet portal is just sort of variation on the internet portal, but interestingly and importantly, now that now with the newest, the current licensing model, people who are not formal users in your organization can access your extranet portal and can access your SharePoint services and not have to have a license for them. Whereas there was and they can do a lot of things in SharePoint. They can be, I think they can even possibly be owners of subsites. They can certainly be editors and be active, not just view only, but actually do a lot in SharePoint. Whereas there was in earlier iterations, extranets were difficult to do financially because of the licensing challenges. It is even been used for internet sites, for public internet sites. That is to say, it can be your content management system for a website. And then this fifth point is kind of interesting and important. I think that it's part of Microsoft's vision for SharePoint is really in some ways a competitor to things like Salesforce, where it's actually a framework on which other things can be built, and they're developing out a SharePoint store where third parties can develop apps that run on SharePoint, and other line of business apps can integrate with SharePoint, and it can really be almost a platform as much as anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great to highlight. And so just to reiterate, one of the audience questions is SharePoint part of Office 365, or do you pay extra? And it is, in fact, included as part of Office 365. So especially if you're at the E1, which is free for most 501c3 nonprofits, it's included in the feature set that you're already getting, along with your Exchange Online and Link as well. So that certainly is a nice benefit as well.
So why SharePoint? I'm going to try to pick things up a little bit in terms of watching the time. I think the original vision for SharePoint was to empower end users. That there was a time when SharePoint was first sort of released back in the early days when all IT solutions went through a long sort of, you get requirements from your end users, those go to the IT department, they do requirements analysis and then look at different solutions, and then they deliver the solution, either they custom build or they buy something off the shelf, and then that goes back to the users. And SharePoint's, the idea of it is that a lot of things can be added by the users themselves, that you can give someone a collaborative space in your SharePoint farm, and they can, add lists, they can do this, they can do that, without necessarily going for the IT department every time. How true that is, how sophisticated you need to be, I think that's an interesting question. In our experience, certainly I don't consider myself in any way a developer, and I'm able to do some stuff in SharePoint that I, just by Googling and looking around and figuring things out. It's not as simple as, creating a Word document is for most users. It's like, at least I don't, how do I make this bold? Can you make that word bold for me? I don't have to do that. I can make it bold on my own. But if I want to add a list or a web part, I may or may not be able to do that myself. It is browser-based as compared to, like, this is now maybe comparing it to like a file share. The fact that it's browser-based, I think in the past has been viewed as kind of a negative because it means clicks and links and, click on the back arrow to go back to where you were, and isn't this a nuisance, and wait for things to load and URLs. But the reality is that we're getting so used to things being in the browser with software as a service now that I think bandwidth is such that this is no longer necessarily a negative. It's actually kind of a positive. It means the third point, that it's accessible from anywhere, because anywhere you have a browser and internet access, you can access your SharePoint site. It is part of the Microsoft Office ecosystem, by which I mean to say that Microsoft's done a lot of work to make sure that Office 2013 integrates very well with it. That's a major plus for those organizations that use Microsoft Office regularly. And finally, the Microsoft Office 365 marketplace means that it's not just what Microsoft's delivering to you now anymore. It's also third-party app developers who are developing solutions that run on top of SharePoint.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So specifically today, we'll be talking about our example of SharePoint as a file server, since that's, I think, what we see most organizations take that first step in. And in terms of some of the benefits, we've talked a bit about the Office 2013 example already, but it does essentially provide almost unlimited storage capacity. While there is a limit that's provided by Microsoft, and I'll share that link, one doesn't have to be concerned about kind of pre-purchasing enough hardware to kind of accommodate the needs. It can grow as the organization grows and as the needs change. So the issues of I think managing the physical file server are going away. And the focus can really be on the usability and the extensibility of the system. Some of the other I think nice things that come along with SharePoint as as the file server is including some built-in versioning. So that's I think a strong suit of versioning. Office Online, so that is kind of Microsoft's I think bid to basically catch up with Google and in the Google Docs. Web-based editing tools is included as well. I think in our experience, it's getting better every day. It's still not 100% replacement for your desktop version of Microsoft Office, but it does a pretty good job, and the integration between the online version and the desktop version is really good. And I think one of the notable improvements, especially with the newest version of SharePoint, is the improved search. So I think that's been a historical struggle with SharePoint, is just kind of getting the search and kind of finding the information, but that's been improved, I would say, pretty dramatically in the newest version of SharePoint Online. So Steve, I'll let you talk a little bit about the comparison of a local file server with the Office 365.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. This is a little bit of a repeat of what we just said, but I think there's a couple things worth pointing out. So this is transitioning a little bit. We were actually have become most interested in Office 365 SharePoint as a replacement for a traditional on-premise file server. That's a need that we have been feeling among our clients for a while now. We have this on-premise file server. It's time to replace it. Do we buy a new physical server, or do we add a new VM to our physical space? We kind of want to get more and more of our stuff in the cloud. Where do we put it? We've looked at other cloud file sharing options: Dropbox, Box, Ignite. But SharePoint is definitely one of those competitors, and we're looking at it through that lens. So the file server has the traditional file share, folders and subfolders and sub-subfolders and so on, and then finally files, and that's the traditional it's the organizational methodology. You do have folders, or again certainly have folders as organizational building blocks in SharePoint, and we'll see that in some screen shows later on. But there's also an emphasis on metadata. On tagging, essentially, for file repositories in SharePoint, which are called libraries. So that can be your organizing principle also. Reliable versioning meant save as with a new name. The shadow copy might have been able to give you some of that also if you made a mistake in something. But traditionally, I remember in doing a contract for a project, and there'd be the January 12th version, then there's the January 12th V Steve, and then there's, and that's what you see all these things as you sort of work on things collaboratively. Now we have automatic versioning once you turn it on in SharePoint, setting that to a good setting for you, and you can sort of go back and forth. For local use, documents already automatically lock on a file server. That's so if somebody opens a Word document on the local file server and someone else tries to open it, it says someone else has this open. Do you want to check out a read-only copy? That's kind of a nice feature. With SharePoint, there's a couple things going on here. You can check in and check out documents in the browser, and that's, I think, powerful and important. But sort of just ad hoc in our testing and piloting of it, I've been very impressed with how well Office, it's almost like magic fairy dust. A colleague and I were working on a document of some sort in SharePoint, and I had it open in a local copy of Word, and he had it open in Word Online in a browser, and all of a sudden a little thing sort of popped up indicating there's some gray or something in my version in Word, and it just sort of indicated that I should sort of resave the document. So I did that. It was essentially a refresh, and all of a sudden a bunch of his changes appeared in my document, and we were working in different parts of the document. I wasn't even aware of it. I was like, well, that is cool. So just sort of, something that sort of SharePoint allows, is that sort of almost collaborative space. So that's actually bleeds into the next one. So I'll just skip that. But yeah, it's a pretty powerful thing. With the file server, there's no reasonable file size limit. With SharePoint, Office 365 SharePoint, there's a 2 gigabyte file size limit. Practically, I think this might be driven by the fact that the back end of SharePoint is a SQL database, and there may be some technical reasons for that, because certainly in terms of trying to keep up or compete with Dropbox and Google Drive and some others, I would think Microsoft would want to have a higher limit than this. But they do have a 2 gig file size limit. Practically speaking, we would not be recommending that our clients use SharePoint as a file server for like large media files anyway. That there probably is better places than that for large media files. So the straightforward local access, you just click until you find your file, double click, and it opens on a file server. But remote access can be tough. You might need a VPN, you might need a terminal server. There are other solutions for that, but it's never been like a simple thing. With Office 365 SharePoint, everybody's remote all the time, so you kind of get used to sort of accessing it through either your browser, and or if you have a computer that you have synced to a library, it actually can be opened through your Windows Explorer on your local computer. And finally, for the file server, the way you sort of set up your structure to begin with is you set up your top-level root folder structure. Maybe you have finance, maybe you have HR, maybe you have programs, whatever you have in your root structure, and then you kind of maybe you fill out the next level down, but at some point your users just start creating folders and files and sort of organizing, and you hope for the best, and 10 years later you throw up your hands and say, man, files are all over the place. It's kind of organized, but we kind of know where most of the stuff is. But if you ask me to find something that was written 3 years ago, it might be hard to find. I think the same thing is probably true with SharePoint, but there's more architecture decisions to be made. How you divide things up into sites and libraries, what metadata you're going to use. There's still a matter of hoping for the best, but you also need to sort of plan for ongoing adjustment and maintenance of your organization. That's it for me on that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks for the overview, Steve. As we look at so I think it's, as you look at those issues that Steve talked about, I think particularly the difference on the file server and SharePoint Online is that I think the point is that SharePoint is an information system. It's not necessarily a technology project. And so I think the historical knock against SharePoint is that Microsoft has kind of continued to make it easy/free to kind of get started. And so there's certainly lots of stories out there about organizations implementing SharePoint because somebody gets excited about it, but then 6 months later, 10% of the organization is kind of taken to it, and it just kind of dies on the vine. And so it really is an information system that needs to be, kind of encouraged and cultivated, as opposed to just, the file server that everybody's, I think, expected to use. So, setting up that SharePoint site in Office 365 is pretty easy. Adding the library for files is a piece of cake, and I'll let Steve talk a little bit about kind of making it, those steps to to make it useful.
So there are two approaches to making it a file server. I'm going to. Did I go to the next slide on this, Matt, or did you want me to talk about? Yeah. So there's two things, and the first way is kind of sidestepping this whole SharePoint as an information system and really saying SharePoint is just going to be our file server. And the term Matt uses, I don't know if it's a formal term or not, but he uses it so much that I've gotten used to it, is forklift your entire file server to SharePoint. And this can be done, and we have done this for clients, and in fact, the screenshot is from a client that gave us permission to use this, although we've redacted the identifying information as best we could. So this is the same file structure they had on their old file server. It looks like Windows Explorer looked like to them, and there wasn't really a lot of requirements gathering. I would say this is something that you do when you're very small. This organization might have like 6 users, and you're really limited in your funds, and your expectations of leveraging SharePoint are low, and you really just want to get sort of a file server in the cloud. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I think in the long run, if you can, it's better to take the second approach, which is to next slide to what we're doing anyway at Community IT is leaving our current server as an archive. So we're not spending the time to build out a huge designed architecture for every file that's on our current file server. Because some of the files, most of the files on our file server are files that are not actively used and really are only there because, probably most of them are only there because we don't want to take the time to figure out whether we can throw them away or not. Some of them probably we want to keep around, but some of them literally we could throw away if we just took the time to go through them one by one and toss them. So they're going to keep them because that's the simplest thing to do, but we're just going to keep them in some sort of archive. And maybe that archive will end up on SharePoint, but it's not going to be sort of the active place where SharePoint's really being leveraged for collaboration. And then we're going to create new libraries in SharePoint for the new files that are being actively collaborated on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it's the move is that it is a good time, I think, to develop this plan, because I think historically the file server migration has been, file sizes, file storage space is cheap. Let's just kind of keep rolling it on from one file server to another and so I think this, the move to the cloud provides a good opportunity to be a bit more deliberate in terms of looking at a number of these things on the planning front.
So things to plan. First of all, I hope in an ideal situation the first question's already addressed because you already know about about IT governance, but there needs to be someone who's sort of responsible for the decisions about SharePoint. Things like the other things that are down this list, someone needs to sort of own the final say on those decisions. There can be input from lots of different stakeholders, but someone ultimately needs to be responsible for sort of the governance, just like any other IT thing. And then it's nice to have a SharePoint champion. That could be the person who has the most, who you think would be most able to do sort of SharePoint development, keeping in mind that development is loosely used here. I mean, mostly we're talking about using things that are out of the box from SharePoint, but who can sort of get things going, who can be the person that SharePoint questions go to. Having that person, it could be the same person who's responsible for the governance, but it very well may not be. And then you start getting to the nitty-gritty. So what sites do you need in SharePoint? There are the whole thing could be called a site collection. I'm a little fuzzy on this because I kind of feel like, in fact, the whole Office 365 SharePoint is in some ways Microsoft's giant site collection, and then they give each of their tenants like a sub-site. So what I think of as our site collection may be to Microsoft a sub-site. I'm not sure how that works, but in any case, you sort of have the site collection, and then you have sites within it. And a site can contain a number of different things. It can contain libraries, which are document repositories. It can contain lists. Lists sort of look like spreadsheets to me, but they can probably do more than that. And then they can have web parts, which is can mean lots of different things. And I'm not even sure whether or not like lists are actually a subset of web parts. The taxonomy on this is a little bit fuzzy to me sometimes. But the way we've done it in our pilot is that we've had, there's a project team site, and that's distinct from we'll come back to the other slide, but thank you, Matt. That's distinct from the network manager's site. I am the project manager who owns the project team site. A network manager, the head of our network management practice, I guess, is the network manager's site owner. And then there's a third site, which is our information systems consulting site. So I am the owner of the project site, but I don't really have any input or even access to the network manager's site at this point, although if I needed access and we'll talk about how information moves, I could be made perhaps a user on the network manager's site, but may not be the owner of the network manager's site. So as the owner of the projects team site, I can do things like add web parts, add lists, change default views, all those things that are useful to me, I'm able to do. So it's not like, unlike a file server where there's one file server, with SharePoint, you think about the sort of design architecture of how many different sites you are, and then who owns those sites. And then sort of a follow-up question is, how does information move between sites and libraries? And that can be that is interesting, because a document that for example, a project. For a project, we might develop documentation for end users as part of a project, and we think of that as our documentation. That's part of our project. But at some point, it may shift to a site where we keep our client documentation, and how does it move there? Does it move as a I'm going to blank on the word here, but does it as almost like a bookmark or a shortcut, or does the actual document move? These are things that can be done, and you just sort of think about how to do it. What metadata do you want to apply? This is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about for ourselves, but again, metadata is like these tagging things. For community IT, probably the most important metadata for any document is the client name. So pretty much well, not every document, but a lot of the documents I certainly work with in projects are associated with a particular client, and so I tag it with that client data. And so we've agreed that metadata will actually apply across our site collection. So the term we use for a particular client is the same, like if it's an abbreviation, it's the same abbreviation in the project site as it is in the network manager's site. And that helps for searching and so forth, that we don't want, we sort of create like a standard taxonomy for ourselves. I'd say another point for planning is to plan for change. We have found that it has evolved quite a bit in the months that we've been doing our SharePoint pilot, and I expect it will continue to evolve as we move from pilot into production. So you don't have to get everything exactly right. I don't think that means you don't do any planning, but you don't have to keep the idea of getting everything perfect before you sort of move into your SharePoint site. I think would be foolish. I think it's a little bit like maybe moving into a new office or a new house, I guess, where you definitely want to think about where is the sofa going to go, and where the chair is going to go, and the bed and so forth. You don't just pile it all in, but at the same time, to not be able to move in until you know where every last thing is going to go would be crazy. You sort of put things where you think they go. You start moving you start putting things around it. It fits great. If the places where it doesn't fit, you make adjustments. And that fits in with the second to last point there is don't overbuild, especially initially. And then lastly, of course, as with any project, and especially any information systems project, you need to think about how you're going to bring your users along.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, so Steve already talked a little bit about the kind of R3 use cases that we were exploring here at Community IT in terms of this. We, like a lot of other organizations, have a 15-year-old file server, that's at a good point to be replaced, and so we have some specific use cases that we were considering for how to address this need for upgrading our file server, providing a place to store files, but yet being more effective in our ability to collaborate, to search, and to manage information. So I'll go ahead and just turn over to Steve to talk a little bit about the pilot goals for that testing. Yeah,
so we definitely wanted to. In some ways, I feel like we are. For us to, I'm at a point where I can say I like SharePoint, and I do think it's a solution that I will be comfortable recommending to clients, and I not in every case, but that I think it's something that should definitely be on the list of possible solutions. And that's based on those experiences I've had in the last months doing this pilot, and I will say that in some ways I'm a good person to say that, and I think a lot of us here were, because we did have, I would say collectively, fairly negative feelings about SharePoint, and so that first thing there about assessing the general usability of the solution, was important to us. We had experiences with SharePoint where we just felt like it's just too many clicks, too hard, not worth it. Clients, users will never accept it, and we'd seen, and I had seen a number of places in doing network assessments and stuff where there were SharePoint sites that were not being used, and IT departments saying, yeah, we tried, they wanted something that was remotely accessible, so we gave them this, and it just never worked. So that was one of the goals. We wanted to trial different file folder organization approaches that has to do with things like the metadata and how we organized it. We played with that a good bit. We wanted to play with the different sharing requirements, external sharing, internal sharing, and so forth. We wanted to determine how accessible it would be for, Office 2010, Mac OS, and so on. I don't think I'm going to come back to this. I'll just mention that I'd say that it works fine with Mac OS and with Office 2010. It works better with Windows and Office 2013. I'd say, and I use a Mac a lot, I would say that it's not any worse for me using a Mac with SharePoint, with Office 365 SharePoint, than it is using a Mac for me with anything else that I live in a Windows world. So it's not worse than average. It's just kind of what you learn to expect as a Mac user, that everything's just a little harder than it is for your colleagues using Windows. But I do find that it's pretty great to be able to natively work on my Mac from home on my MacBook Air and not have to log into the terminal server, because I can just access all of my files that I'm working on actively through Office 365. And then we wanted to sort of assess the magnitude of change management required to sort of move this from pilot into production. And I'd say that's still something that we're still trying to figure out. I think we have a pretty sophisticated user base, and we should probably be able to move into using this more and more fairly easily, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that yet.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let's kind of move quickly, I think, through some of the screenshots from the pilot. So
yeah. This is just a quick. This is nothing. It's just a quick picture that shows sort of what. Well, I think it's worth just mentioning that one of the things that we have not done much of is like the beautification of SharePoint. You can do all sorts of really snazzy things, and we're in the pilot stage, and we're just using the stock stuff that came from Office 365. But there you see the network management, the IS consultings, over there is the projects that has that, I don't know what that is, a phone or a mailbox or something there on the right. So the next slide is my main library, and it's got all the redactions on it, sort of protect the innocent. But I just wanted to point out a couple quick things. The metadata, I chose what metadata to show up in this. This is the standard view. It shows the modified date. It shows the client ID, the project type, so I can search for whether it's a software deployment or an Office move or an Office 365 migration. I have a project doc status, which is my own terminology: active, draft, complete. I think there's a couple others in there. And then the content type, I think, is also stuff that I've created. And like the last one there in the bottom line, inf project SSA, that's a particular type of document that we, it's a contract essentially. So I'm the one. There are lots and lots of other metadata that I could put in this view. This is the view that works well for our team, and that's sort of that's the kind of users can do it themselves flexibility that's really easy. That you just click a button that says modify view. It's very simple. I think an average user that's comfortable with technology can do that kind of a thing. So the next slide. This is very quick. Just a couple things that are kind of cool that I wanted to show, and it won't take long at all to do it. So you can click on the client ID sort of column on that menu, and then up pops this thing that says, you want to filter the column ID by, you can't sort of, but you want to filter by a certain one. So I can pull down to a particular client ID, click on that, and then only the documents that have that tag will show in my view. That's pretty great. One of the downsides, a bit cumbersome, because we already have like 50. I have like 50 different tags in here. That's in the couple months that I've been doing this. I've written contracts or documentation or whatever for 50 different clients, and so And the way that this works is that it only pulls down 20, and then I have to click a more button, wait a second, and then 20 more show up. And then if it happens to be like a client that's initials begins with a Y, I have to click through that twice. So one of my development goals, and this may or may not be an example of where it's a little hard for the end user, harder than Microsoft thinks it should be. I'd like to have a filter like field where I can just type in. I know what the client ID is. I don't have to browse for it. So something to work on and build out as we keep going. The next slide shows, this is now from the Network Manager's site. They gave me permission to get to get on it. I couldn't even get on it until they gave me permission to. And now I got on so that I could get some screenshots. This shows something that I think is pretty cool. So internally it's shared with some of our network. This document called July Monthly Agenda is shared with some internal users that you can see their names there. These are colleagues of ours. But then you can also create links. You can create a view-only link, or you can create an edit link. This one's already had an edit link created. So if that link is sent to anyone, they can open a document in, well, I don't think it opens locally. I think it opens in like Word Online. In this case, it's a Word document. And then that person can edit it, and those edits will save to the SharePoint site. So you can share things with your external people fairly easily. For us, that means sharing them with clients. So agendas can be emailed, a link can be emailed to a client and saying, hey, this meeting next Thursday, here's the agenda. If you have any edits, please make them. That's really a nice workflow for us. You could also send a view-only link, and then you can disable this link so that it no longer works if you want to. This one is still active, so it was enabled. The project site is by design this functionality doesn't exist on it. So those are choices that you get to make. The next slide that Matt flashed up there for a second is this is the only third-party app that we've put in so far. We had a DocuSign account, which is electronic signature account. DocuSign's along with Adobe, one of the main electronic signature services. But they have a partnership with Microsoft, so they have their own Microsoft Office 365 SharePoint app. I think they might have one that works for on-premise SharePoint too. But anyway, so this is kind of cool. I can check that SSA Office Move 2014 July that's down there at the bottom. I check that one. Then I can click on Get Signatures in the DocuSign tab on my library, and then I can sort of send it straight from SharePoint to my client, who can electronically sign it, which then comes back automatically and gets dropped in that DocuSign Documents folder that you see there in the middle of the screenshot. So everything's done in SharePoint. Before that, I would have the collaborative space in SharePoint to get the document to the point where it was ready to be sent to the client, but then I would have to upload it to DocuSign, and then the executed document would live in the DocuSign portal, and then I'd end up having sort of two software as a services, two places where the documents were, the executed documents in one service and the rest of the product document in the other. This way they're all in one place. That's pretty slick. That's pretty valuable to us. And it's the kind of thing that I think is just happening more and more with SharePoint. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but these are the things that I can control as the project site owner. Nura, as the network manager site owner, would have a similar screen for his, so I can, you can see their look and feel, site actions. Term store management is in purple because I've clicked on that already. That's where I can adjust, and I'll show that in a second. I can adjust the terms. Here is the screenshot of that, where I can, add a project type is what I could do right here if I wanted to. You can see the different product types that we have. Up above there, under the company thing, is where we have things that are not just for the projects board, but for the entire site collection. And where am I here? Okay, this is the last. I think this is one of the last screenshots. Not quite, but these are templates that I've created as not a developer. yes, I know how to use technology, but I'm in no way a SharePoint developer or know how to code it all. But I was able to very easily add these templates. So now in the projects library, if you click on New Document in the pull-down menu, you get these choices. And each of these is a template, which is, helps with workflows and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last thing is if you have Office 2010, my experience was that you could there was like an Office 2010 SharePoint application that sort of had this sort of upload download feature. In Office 2013, when I just click on in SharePoint, I click on a button called Synchronize. And there's an Office, again, it must be an Office 2013 app running in the background, but it sort of all happens much more seamlessly. And so this is actually showing what's locally on somewhere on my system drive of my desktop. But it's, and so I probably could find it by going through Windows Explorer, but it's a lot like Dropbox works. People are used to how it works with Dropbox, where there's a local cache copy of what's going on in Dropbox. This is a local cached copy of what's going on in this particular SharePoint library. So I can work offline, and then it will resync later. I can. One of the ways that this is useful is that moving things around in the browser it's sort of a one file at a time kind of thing, but this you can do things like you can drag and drop 8 documents into the project's documents window in Windows Explorer, and it will upload into the SharePoint library for you. So it just shows up in my favorites. It's another nice feature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say that this is more so a feature of Office 2013 than Windows 7 or Windows 8. So, I think the Office version, kind of is more important than your version of Windows. As that being said, I think Windows 8, Server 2012. I think a lot of this stuff kind of works. Better, is more tightly integrated than if you're on older versions. And I would say with Microsoft and with their change to the subscription licensing model, it really doesn't cost that much additional money to go up to the most recent version of Office. And it's included as part of Microsoft's E3 package, and it can also be purchased as a standalone for, I think it's $2 a month. And the nice thing about that is that it gives you the licensing for for five devices, including iPads, tablets, so that you can have access to it from multiple different platforms. The other thing I'll just note here, since it's highlighted, is that you can see, that Steve has the local SharePoint folder, which shows you, the things that are in the project's documents library, and then there's this OneDrive link as well. So we haven't talked about OneDrive, but I would say OneDrive is analogous to perhaps your personal directory. So for many organizations, that you have your P drive or whatever your personal file store is, and so OneDrive is analogous to that. It is a bit of a blurry line between OneDrive or SharePoint. OneDrive right now, I think there's a 1 terabyte of storage is included as part of that, as part of the subscription, but it is much more, I guess, individually centric. You can share files from it. You can, kind of make it a centralized collaboration space, but it's not quite geared towards, a lot of, teamwork and other applications to be added on top of it. So it's really a personalized storage area, whereas SharePoint is, I think, designed to be that collaborative space and to do, kind of much more than just the document storage.
Yeah, in the slide share notes, we have some links, and one of them talks about how, OneDrive is great, but if you are trying to replace your file server, you really want to think about it, the collaborative space as being in SharePoint.
Exactly. Yeah, there was a comment. Again, there is a 2 gig limit for files in SharePoint. I don't think that exists. That doesn't exist in OneDrive. I'm not sure what that limit is, but again, it may influence your choice. SharePoint I think is good for kind of office documents, but if you're primarily doing, I don't know if you're a design firm and you're doing a lot of AutoCAD files that need quick local access, it might not be the best fit for for that use case. So it's going to be good for most office applications, but if you have really large design files or digital assets, there might be a better solution to handle those those assets. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I think we'll have some time for questions, but wanted to transition a bit to some of the wins and lessons learned.
Yeah. So remote access is great. It really is. I frequently work where I'm not on the LAN, and I have a VPN, and the VPN works great. It does exactly what it's supposed to do, and I hate it. I'm so pleased not to have to use it as much as I used to. I think tags provide greater flexibility for file organization. So one of the obvious places where that matters is that, for me, is that I have my project type tag, which is just sort of helpful for searching later to find documents related to a particular kind of project. It's great to be able to tag it. Sometimes projects cover 2 things at once, and it's nice to be able to tag a single project with 2 tags so that I can, if it's an Office 365 migration with an Office 2013 upgrade included, it'll show up in my software deployment search, but it will also show up in my Office 365 migration search. Search is powerful. I think the design process can be fun. It can also be a little bit of a rabbit hole where I spend 3 hours later, I realize that all I've been doing is tweaking my SharePoint site and not getting revenue-producing work done. Word Online is intriguing. I say intriguing and not like great, only because I think it's not the same as working in a local copy of Word. It's really great for a quick edit, fixing something, particularly in a collaborative setting with someone else who's on Word Online at the same time as you. But if you want to do serious editing, you're going to want to open it in the local Word at this point still. But it's come a long ways. It is a very functional experience, but it's not nearly as full functional as local Word. And then the DocuSign app for us is a promising win. I say promising because it's still like it's only been out for a couple months, and there's sometimes when it doesn't quite behave the way I want it to. It crashes or gives me an error when I'm trying to do something. But most of the time, recently, it's been working pretty well. It's been like it gets updated like every 3 weeks, and so we reinstall the newest version, and then that's less buggy than the old version. So that's sort of the way it is. Actually, with software as a service, that things sort of develop as you use them. It's kind of cool. As far as the reality check or the lessons learned or things that let's keep in mind, you do need to plan for your backup or your retention, your archiving with SharePoint. I mean, there are services that will back up your Office 365 data for you, and you'd want to consider doing that. Microsoft has good retention in terms of the versioning and so on, but like if something's deleted, and can you get it back? That's not so clear. I think you need to have a third party for that. I mentioned that the browser was designed for one-time file manipulation. I also mentioned the DocuSign app that probably doesn't work. Sometimes finding data or sites or subsites can be hard if you don't have like the email that says, check out this, and I'm sharing you this file with you. It's not quite as easy, it's a file server share. You can sort of browse and sort of dig around until you find it. Because everything's sort of under a URL, and they aren't necessarily the links don't necessarily appear anywhere. So sometimes, the only way to get to something is to have the URL, and if you've lost that URL or you don't know that URL, it can be troubling. And I think that speaks to the last point about sharing outside the organization. And then just sort of in general for us, we do a lot of things by the bootstrap approach, where we keep business as usual as we go along. But it does mean things are slow. And in the meantime, we still have files on the old server, on the old file server, and we have this new thing, and you have to keep track of which is where. And also, like if I introduce a new way of organizing things, do I go back to all my old files and change them, or do I just sort of say, I'm moving forward? And that's sort of something that, that's sort of the way it goes with Bootstrap. Matt, do you want to talk about the next slide?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the recommendations, I think Steve's done a good job of explaining and kind of describing our process and our lessons learned. So I think, in a bit more of a kind of a succinct way, SharePoint is a complex system, and so it's not something, that I think you just want to, kind of turn an intern loose and say, okay, go for it, design our SharePoint site. This is a big and complicated system that can provide a lot of benefits, and I think it should be kind of treated with kind of that deliberate care and attention. And again, I say recognize that it's an information systems project. While it is just technology and it's easy to set up, and if you're an IT person, kind of turning it on and making it available to your users is an easy thing to do, but I think the focus here is really on effective use and adoption of the system. So this kind of go back to the 80-20 rule. It is only 20% technology and kind of setting up the architecture, but you're going to have 80% of your time focused on end user training and developing requirements, and having that dialogue to kind of show people how it's better, why it's better, and identifying those opportunities. I would say in general, if you can, start with a clean slate. Just kind of forklifting and moving, your existing file system, kind of just translating into the cloud, you're not going to really get those benefits. So if you can start with a clean slate, think about how you want to interact with your information, think about those metadata tags, plan out, if we could be more efficient, what are those components that are going to get us there? If we can start with a clean slate, you're going to, I think, be much more successful. Again, start small and incorporate lessons learned. This isn't a big, you don't have to kind of get it right the very first time, and you can adopt a more agile approach of testing things out, experimenting, figuring out what works, figuring out how it's most effective, and then build off of those successes. And then finally, appoint a SharePoint administrator. I mean, somebody does need to kind of have ownership over the ongoing site administration and updates, and and just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean you can kind of ignore kind of all those administrator good practices that you have now, or maybe you need to have with your existing system.
Yeah, I was going to say that I don't know how helpful this is, but to me, it's a little bit akin to sort of a Salesforce implementation. Like, it makes sense to start out with a small thing, just to sort of accomplish one thing, pilot that, see how it works, and then sort of build out. But you don't. It's a big thing, and for it to be really successful, you really need to get a lot of stakeholders involved.
Mm-hmm. Great. So move along. There's a couple of links that are here, I think, that are helpful additional reading. So we'll go ahead and tweet those out, and obviously they'll be available as part of the slide share that's provided. We've gone through, I think, a good amount of the questions that have come in during the session. If there were some specific questions that didn't get answered, please feel free to reach out to Steve or myself, or include those questions in the follow-up survey that you'll see whenever the webinar ends, and we'll do our best to maybe incorporate some of those questions into a blog article that we do as a follow-up. So our next webinar will be Thursday, August 28th, where we'll be talking about some cloud migration planning. So that'll be with Johan and Steve again. And so that webinar will be focused not necessarily on kind of specific technology solutions, but kind of more of a generalized framework in terms of how do you make decisions about the cloud and what does that mean. So I think that'll be a really great presentation to be a part of. So please put that on your calendar, and we'll look forward to engaging with you then. Again,